Hi everyone, this is Claire with the Here and There Collective. I'm here today with Jacqueline Qiu, our current studio artist resident, and we're here to talk a little bit about the residency program thus far, as well as to speak about her practice in a little bit more depth. Welcome, Jacqueline.
Thank you for having me, Claire.
I thought maybe we could start off with a quick introduction of you and your practice, and then we can dig into the residency.
Sure. I've been in New York about 2 years, and I'm working within sort of a fiber installation space coming from a background in painting.
So the residency is about 6 months long. We're towards the end of your time. So I was wondering, maybe now that we're towards the end, you can talk a little bit about your experience. All of the artists who come in through the residency have a general idea of what they want to do in the studio during their time. And sometimes it goes exactly in that way, and sometimes it kind of twists and turns and changes within their practice. Do you want to tell us a little bit about your experience? Anything that was particularly challenging or surprising?
Yeah, I moved into this space and I don't think I had a very specific idea of like what I wanted to do in this space. I just knew I wanted to continue creating these tapestry series. So I actually even like moved my like portable vertical loom into the space and was getting ready to use it. And then I think my first couple of days I was just setting up, and then I was just looking at these walls and I was like, wow, like I'm in this space where it's completely empty, because beforehand I was working in my apartment. So like it was always completely sacrificing any sort of like living space. And also like the walls were something that were kept like clean and bare. I never really like nailed or drilled into them. But I was moving in and I was looking at this wall and I was like, oh, it's so blank. And I was like, what if I just made a piece like that consumed the space of that entire wall while I was here? And I actually, before I started, I like asked you, and you very lightly said, do it. And then I did.
Because you also brought up this wall piece that we're sitting in front of, and it's, I think, the largest kind of woven piece that you've worked on until now. Can you tell us a little bit more about the decision to go onto the wall? This is fully hand woven, and we can see the screws that are holding together the top and the bottom, as well as interior, the horizontal ones as well.
Yeah, so originally I've been like based on like weaving looms for these like tapestry installations, but they were always kind of like hanging within the air. And like the loom sort of creates like a very rigid structure you have to work within. And the first step is kind of setting up this like vertically oriented yarn, which is the warp. And that's sort of, sometimes I think of that as like the paper for like if you're thinking of like relating it to drawing or painting, like that's the paper setup, like the blank canvas or something. But with the wall piece, I actually began doing that same thing. So it's sort of based on the structure of the frame loom, which is the simplest loom. It's just like you have to have something to adhere the yarn to at the top and the bottom, and then you just set up your warp that way. So I began like that as usual at first, but there was such like sort of freedom to be able to set up the machine. I mean, I know it's the machine that I'm using, that I realized I didn't really have to follow that conventional grid. So that's kind of why the screws sort of take on a very like free agency in terms of creating new anchor points or places where the color changes. Like the original setup of the paper that usually has to happen, the vertical lines, it's like completely free form. Instead, like they're slanting a lot. Sometimes like there isn't the warp setup in gapping areas. The color changes in the middle. Like that's all stuff you can't really do on a loom. So creating like my own weaving setup on the wall like really opened up the structural possibilities in weaving, which I'm always playing with.
thinking about the word freedom, but also a lot about the word levity when thinking about your work, because I feel like there's obviously this kind of lightness that you can see with literal light kind of passing through the individual pieces, but also the like movement that happens with wind. And yet, even with this piece, you can kind of see the effects of gravity in different locations. So I wonder if you can speak a little bit more about that freedom in kind of the structure and how you are still finding kind of like roots, anchors to hold on to that's coming in from your previous kind of practice.
Yeah, levity and lightness and movement is definitely very important to the works. It's funny because when I first started making these weavings, I'm going really way back now, but when I first started, I was looking at these artifacts in the museum called 缂丝 weavings, also translates to like cut silk or carved silk. But it was a tapestry weaving technique, a slit tapestry weaving technique that had sort of like gaps and openings of negative space, and there was a really interesting relationship between weaving and ink painting in China at the time. So that's what I was exploring. I was trying to be much more faithful to kind of not recreating, but kind of like mimicking or learning that technique on my own. And I originally wanted to make this really beautiful, intricate tapestry for people to step on. And then I had like a visit with my advisor, and they were like, "You don't want people to step on this. Like you cannot do that," because I had like worked for like maybe like 2 weeks on a section like this small, because that's how slow the pace is. So I think like oftentimes the work is exploring this tension and command through gentleness and softness or flexibility, and like it's a movable and changeable thing. It's like more alive to me in a way that other mediums aren't, and I think that aliveness is also what makes it so that it can change and it can be affected, it can be harmed. So like I think it invokes in other people, like you have to understand the power and presence of something that is fragile, and like how do you interact with that. So like the lightness, and in terms of like weight, but also the lightness is what allows it to move in the wind. The like thinness of the material is what makes it translucent. The porousness is also what like makes you be able to see through, and all those things make it reflect time and space in a much deeper way, and engage like the body of the person in a different way.
I'm so glad that you brought up this somewhat origin story, because I think there is something extremely human about the works, that fragility and the relationship to the body. It comes out in different ways for each of your works. I think the piece behind us is particularly, the relationship to the body is this kind of this awe that you feel when you stand in front of it because of the scale of the piece as well as the intricate details. And then we also are sitting with your other hand-woven pieces that include a relationship to the body that can be discovered as the person or the viewer is standing in front of them for longer. I know that there is a relationship to your body casting performance piece that you did with these works as well. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the body cast performance, and then we can talk again, like this kind of through line that happened with the woven pieces.
Yeah. The body cast piece, I would say it's most directly in conversation, or was made during the same time as this piece. That was the first one where like I felt there was a more visible relationship to the body. A lot of it was like exploring the bathing culture in Iceland. I was in like a very remote town, Blönduós, and I was there for 3 months, and one of the only things to do there was go to this outdoor pool and hot tub, and it was a very like natural and calming experience, and it helped soothe a lot of the pain that I have from the labor of making art. So that was also an interesting relationship, like having a daily sort of bathing routine that helped foster the longevity of my process was meaningful. And then I was there for 3 months and I came back to New York, and obviously it's a very different experience. And I was actually initially like struggling quite a bit when I came back to New York with how to continue my practice, because it was so based in like immersing myself in my surroundings in a sensorial way. So I found myself sort of retreating to the space of the bathtub very often. And I realized, like, that is sort of like a shallow water space, like it's an access to the elements that you can have in the city. So the body cast performance came after I finished the tapestry weaving that's sort of based on the space of the porcelain bathtub. But I wanted to do a collaborative piece, and I also wanted to reach back into my relationship with papermaking. So I had my friend Mallory come do this. But yeah, so I invited her into my apartment and I got in the bathtub, and then she took this like large piece of handmade mulberry paper I made, and we sort of like laid it over me and slowly like started re-wetting the paper, and that's how you make the paper sort of like take on the mold of the body. But it was really interesting because I think it's like exploring time and process in like a very different way, almost like an inverse way to the tapestries, because in that instance my body is like very still and I've given away like my agency and control as the artist to this other person, and there's a lot of trust in that. It's also like collaborative and there's conversation. Like usually my studio practice is so much about like kind of like mulling over things alone. In all of my work, I feel I'm kind of exploring this idea of interior nature, or sort of like an inner garden. It comes from originally like during COVID, I started researching, and this is around the time I also found that weaving technique 课思, but I started researching courtyard gardens in China, like the scholars' gardens. So it's like the architecture is on the outside, and then inside you have this private garden, and that sort of like protective space and access to nature, and it's a space of learning and creativity. Like people would write poems there, they would host like calligraphy writing parties, like artists would paint in their courtyard gardens, and like the importance of like family and privacy and all these things. I was pondering on that, and I feel like I've tried to orient my art practice so that I'm essentially sort of creating that space for myself mentally and sort of in terms of my physical surroundings. But I think it takes on like a very metaphorical meaning in my mind. Like with the body cast performance, like that also feels like an exploration of like an interior garden. And when I say garden, like it sort of becomes just like nature or elements broadly, and it can also become like just a placeholder for like any sort of creativity or nurturing experience.
That makes a lot of sense. I think that there is something about textiles that fascinate viewers because it's more easily read. That relationship to time and labor when someone is viewing, like in comparison to a painting. I feel like you can really see what you mean in terms of every single thread touching your hands.
I don't think I'm exploring like pain as a theme in my works. I think it's more just, it's like a reality of life. I do think I've created like a very wide bandwidth for it within my practice at this moment. I feel like it's like I'm like almost tricking people sometimes, because so much time and work went into making something that seems so delicate and so free, but like getting that effect behind the scenes takes so much work. To like make a gradient in a weaving is like your hand is like this, like for 3 to 6 hours each day for like 4 days, and it's like only you just managed to get a gradient. The gravity of like making a mark in this practice is so intense. And I do feel like it kind of like reflects the way I like think about things in general. But I think having a capacity for that, like, oh, it takes so much work to be tender and to be gentle, I think is meaningful somehow. So the goal is not being enraptured by this pain or labor, but the reality is that sometimes you have to look at those things and be in those things.
I'm always curious about inspiration and then how that ends up in the works themselves, but also little details like, are you listening to music in the studio? Do you have a show on in the background while you're weaving? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. Recently, it's been pretty quiet. Like, I don't want to listen to anything. I do feel that, like, when I'm making, like, sort of crucial decisions, having anything on is distracting. I have to have my brain, like, very empty to be able to listen to my intuition and to let, like, myself have thoughts that flow in and then end up on the tapestry. As I'm working, because the way you make the work is very, like, micro, the point of, like, focus shifts, like, every day depending on which area you're working on. Like, I'm looking this close up and each, like, small section kind of has its own moment of tension or, like, resting space or, like, point of interest. And then after I've worked on that section for, like, a day or two, then I step back and then that section is in conversation with, like, the whole piece. And then over time, like, all these different parts have to be in conversation together without me having had any initial plan for how they would work together. So it's like a very like agile and responsive, amorphous mental process, even though, like, the movement of making is so sort of, like, stunted. So that contrast is very interesting as well.
The most satisfying aspects of your work that I find as a viewer is that you can get really lost in these micro locations. There's something really alive about that process.
When I was working on the loom, I did have that initial setup, and I think the evidence of time is a lot more chronological because the way it's set up is essentially like it's like the warp is set up on a beam, like it's rolled onto a beam. So your paper is much more like a scroll. Like the setup is kind of like a scroll that you shift forward as you continue working, and it's building from the bottom up. And you can only move forward after you've committed to the mark making or the woven yarn in that area. For example, in this piece, if you look at the bottom, there's these like blooms happening, and I think I started this piece around the spring, and I was going outside to parks and seeing like what sort of access to urban nature I did have, and those blossoms were very beautiful. So I was really having so much fun creating this like airy, gauzy, like playful tapestry moment there, sort of exploring the vibrancy of color and texture there. And then on the side you see like there's this very like solid, peaceful white moment that's sort of exploring that man-made cold porcelain surface. And I'm using a lot of like, I think paper yarn and silk yarn there, exploring that sort of quiet resting space right next to that moment of spontaneity. And then as I commit to that, I can build up. And each like new thing I weave is in reference to what I did before, and it is in reference to what I will do in the future, but I don't know what that will be. And I'm like completely comfortable with that. I think I've like trained myself to be very comfortable with it, and it is what I find the most beautiful about this practice for myself, is that I get to be making discoveries.
So not only, is there this relationship to artist and work, but there's this, it's like a document of time. It's like an actual history.
It's a document of time
passing,
and like my body's like movement, right, and like the touch, the tactile relationship to the materials. Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you so much for chatting with me today.
Thank you. Yeah.
All right.